So this summer at Zion, we're walking through and working through the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And here's the thing about the book of Genesis. Even if you didn't grow up in church, even if you don't know a lot of stories in the Bible, my guess is you've probably heard a couple of the stories in Genesis before, just because culturally they're so well known. For example, there's the one kind of near the beginning of the book about Noah and the ark and the big flood. My guess is you've heard that one before. In just a couple of weeks, we're actually going to be talking about a guy named Joseph. And Joseph receives a very special gift from his father. It is a coat that is made of many colors. You may have heard of that one before. Because just culturally, these stories in this book of the Bible, the first book of the Bible, are stories that we tell. But here's what we're discovering and uncovering in this series. If all we get out of the book of Genesis is a collection of very famous stories that we tell, we're actually kind of missing the main message of the book of Genesis. Because at the heart of the book of Genesis is not just a collection of stories that we tell. This book is meant to be a collection of stories that tell us. Tell us things about faith and hope and life and God. At the heart of the book of Genesis, at the heart of this collection of stories that we tell, are meant to be stories that tell us about the things in life that matter the most. And so the big question of this series, the question we're trying to wrestle to the ground every single weekend in this series, all summer long, is this: what can this collection of stories that we tell actually tell us? Now, today as we continue our series, we're actually coming to kind of a mini conclusion, because for the past few weeks, we've been talking about the life and about the times of a pretty famous character in the book of Genesis. His name is Jacob, and today, as we kind of conclude his life, we get to a wrestling match that he has with a very mysterious man. Now, in order to understand this story, we actually need to back up and do a little bit of background work on Jacob, because here's what you need to understand kind of right up front and right out of the chutes. Jacob was a man who in a lot of ways in his day was kind of a professional wrestler. I mean, he had been wrestling with different people, different foes, different enemies his whole life. And what made Jacob's professional wrestling career so interesting is that unlike the professional wrestling of today, his wrestling wasn't even fake, okay? It was real. You never knew what was going to happen. You never knew who was going to win and who was going to come out on top. In fact, Jacob was such an incredible wrestler that he began wrestling even before he was born. So Jacob had a couple of parents. His dad's name was Isaac, and his mom's name was Rebekah. And when his mom, Rebekah, gets pregnant with Jacob, she not only gets pregnant with Jacob, she gets pregnant with Jacob's twin brother Esau. They're both in her womb at the same time. Now, if you've ever been pregnant before, then you've probably had the experience, right? I feel the baby move. I feel the baby kick. Maybe you're here this morning and you've even been pregnant with twins. Here's a question. If you were pregnant with twins, did you ever feel the baby's fights? Because that's actually what Rebekah experiences between her twin boys in her womb. Genesis 25, verse 22, the babies jostled each other within her. In other words, even before they come out of the womb, they're wrestling. Now, this is kind of an unusual experience for Rebekah. She's kind of freaked out, and so she begins praying about it. She goes to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord gives her this answer about why these two babies are fighting. The Lord says to her, verse 23, two nations are actually in your womb, and two peoples from within you are going to be separated. God says to Rebekah, you know how nations sometimes get into wars with each other and fights with each other? They wrestle with each other on a national and international level. Well, what happens with nations is what's going to happen with your two sons. They're going to be wrestling with each other their whole lives long. In fact, eventually they're going to be separated from each other. And the answer to prayer that God has to give actually becomes the lives that these two boys live. Because these two boys, their whole lives long, are wrestling with each other. In fact, their wrestling kind of comes to a head several years later after the boys are born and grow up. In fact, the first of the two boys to be born was Esau. He becomes the oldest by a couple of minutes. And one of the perks of kind of being the oldest son in this culture, in this day and age, is that you would receive what was called in the ancient world the family blessing. Now, in our day and age, to receive a blessing is something you get when you sneeze, right? So you say achoo, and somebody says, God bless you. But in that day, a blessing was something a lot deeper and a lot richer than that. To receive a blessing, to receive the family blessing from like your father, meant that when your father died, you would get to be the boss, CEO, and commander-in-chief of the family. You would be the one who would inherit the lion's share of the inheritance. You would be the one who would get to be the executor of the estate. And Esau, as the slightly older by a couple of minutes of these two boys, was the one who was on tap to receive the family blessing. Now, imagine, just for a second, put yourself in Jacob's shoes, and you miss out on a family blessing like that by just a couple of minutes. How would you feel about that? Because Jacob doesn't feel great about it. In fact, Jacob has always been a little bit jealous of it. Well, one day, Jacob sees an opportunity to try to seize the blessing from his brother. Here's the story, Genesis 27, beginning at verse 1. When Isaac, that's the father, was very old, and his eyes became so weak that he could no longer see, he was kind of legally and basically blind, he calls for Esau, his older son, and he says to him, hey, I'm now an old man, and I don't know the day of my death, but I know it's not far away. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to go and get your equipment, your quiver and your bow. I want you to put on your best camo. This was a hunting family, okay? And I want you to go out to the open country, and I want you to hunt some wild game for me. How about some whitetail, all right? Go out there, get it done, gut the deer, and then bring it back. Prepare it, Isaac says, and prepare it for me. Prepare the kind of tasty food that I like and bring it to me to eat. And then, if you do that, here's what I'll do. I will give you my blessing. Just bring me back some deer. And you will get to be the boss, CEO, and commander-in-chief of this family. Now, put yourself in Esau's shoes for a second. Your dad has just told you that he's going to give you the whole family, the whole estate, all the money. Would you be a little excited about that? Ever seen a man in camo skip? Because I'm guessing that's what Esau was doing when he walked out of his father's room. He was so excited. He was ready to go, but there was a problem. As Isaac and Esau were having this conversation, somebody was listening in. It was actually Isaac's wife, Rebekah. And here's the thing, kind of like with Jacob, it had never really sat well that he missed out on the blessing by just a couple of minutes. Well, it never really sat well with her either because, well, Jacob was kind of a mama's boy. And so the two of them begin to hatch a plot. Here's what they do. Jacob goes to his brother's closet and he gets some camo and dresses up like his brother. Rebekah goes to the freezer, digs out some whitetail, dethaws it, and cooks it, and gets it ready. And Isaac can't really see, and so they see an opportunity. Because Jacob, dressed up like his brother Esau, goes into his father in Genesis 27, verse 18, and he says, my father. And his father says, yes, my son. Now, pick up on this, because notice he doesn't say, yes, Esau, or yes, Jacob, because he doesn't know. He can't see who's actually talking to him. In fact, he needs to ask to figure it out. He actually has to ask, who is this? Who am I talking to? Now, it's at this point where Jacob, dressed up like his brother with food from his mother, commences with what can only be called a con. Because here's how Jacob answers his father's question. Verse 19, he says to his father, I'm Esau. You know, you're firstborn. And guess what I've done is you have told me, please sit up, eat some of my game so that you can give me your blessing. Now, here's the thing. Isaac, he may be blind, but he's not deaf. And he can hear that something is a little off. And so he investigates a little bit. In verse 22, he says, your voice sounds like the voice of Jacob. And then he asks again, just to make sure, are you really my son Esau? And Jacob lies not once, but twice. When Jacob says, I am. So Isaac says, verse 25, my son, bring me some of your game to eat so that I may give you my blessing. That's what Jacob does. And look what Jacob gets in verse 27. He gets the blessing. He wrestles it out of his father and away from his brother. His dad signs over the title of boss, CEO, and commander-in-chief of the family. He gets the inheritance. He gets the estates. He gets it all because his dad believed that he was his older brother. Now, here's the problem with this kind of a con. You know that you're not going to be able to keep it up for long. Because who eventually is going to come back from the open field? Esau. And sure enough, as Jacob is walking out, Esau comes walking in. The two of them start to talk, and when the two of them realize what has happened, Esau, to put it mildly, is not very happy. In fact, he's furious. In fact, here's how furious he is. He actually threatens to kill his little brother, Jacob. And so Jacob has to run away, and it's all that background that actually takes us to our story for today. Because by the time we get to our story for today in Genesis 32, Jacob has been hiding from his brother Esau for, are you ready? 20 years. These two brothers have been estranged from each other for 20 years. And after 20 years, the two of them finally decide through some messengers and some notes back and forth that maybe after 20 years it's time to bury the hatchet, literally, you know, the one that Esau wanted to use to kill Jacob. And so the two of them arrange for a meeting with each other. It's going to take place in the morning. And the night before the meeting in the morning, where Jacob is going to see his older brother Esau for the first time in 20 years, Jacob is, to put it mildly, a little freaked out because he didn't know what's going to happen. He's actually a little bit worried that just like he conned his brother 20 years ago, when he stole the blessing from him, when he wrestled it out of him, he's a little bit worried that maybe his brother is trying to con him, and he's going to come and he's going to slaughter him. And so the night before this big meeting before the two of them, Jacob is getting ready, and here's what he does. Genesis 32, verse 22. That night he takes his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons. He has this big old family by this point. 20 years, he gets a lot of stuff. And he sends them across the ford of the Jabbok. Now, just to kind of situate you here, the Jabbok was a kind of a tributary of the Jordan River. And after he had sent them across the stream, verse 24, he comes back across the ford of the Jabbok. And he spends the night alone. He spends the night alone so he can think and pray and worry about whether things are going to be okay. But as he's worrying about his brother, it turns out that on this night, his brother is actually the least of his worries. Because there he is, all alone, in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, when out of the darkness there emerges this man, and he comes walking toward Jacob. And this man eventually gets right up in front of Jacob, and here's what this man does. He takes him, he grabs him, he pushes him, and he pins him to the ground. This is almost like a mugging, okay? This is like one of these horrible news stories you read about in the newspaper or see about in TV. Somebody's all alone in the middle of the night and somebody comes to kill them. That's what it feels like. And yet this man, as he pins him to the ground, here's what he begins to do. Verse 24 of Genesis 32, this man wrestles with him. Now, this is a strange story, but remember, Jacob is a good wrestler. And so even if this is strange, Jacob is prepared. As this man begins to wrestle him, Jacob knows what to do. And it doesn't take long for Jacob to turn the tables on this mysterious man. And before he knows it, this man is the one who's pinned to the ground. Verse 25, this man can't overpower Jacob. And so what does this man do? Well, he fights dirty. He actually touches the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip is wrenched as he wrestles with the man. Now, here's the thing. If you've ever hurt a hip, how bad does that feel? Real bad. Jacob has this dislocated hip as he's trying to wrestle with this man. But even with a dislocated hip, you know what this man can't do? This man can't win. In fact, Jacob pins him to the ground again. And finally, in verse 26, this man has to say, "Let me go." Because Jacob's scrappy even when his hip hurts. But Jacob says to this man, "No." He says, "Hey, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me." Now, this is already a strange story, but it's at this point in this story that things get even stranger. Because here is this man who is wrestling with Jacob from nowhere, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. And who knows, for all Jacob knows, this man really could be trying to kill him. And yet, this man who is threatening him, who is trying to kill him, who is wrestling with him, Jacob asks for something from him. He asks for a blessing. If you were attacked in the middle of the night, would that be something that you asked for? And what makes this even stranger is that when you stop to think about it, you know what Jacob already has? He already has a blessing. Like a really good one, a big one. He got one 20 years prior from his dad when he stole it from his brother, and he got to be the CEO, chief commanding officer of the family. He already has an inheritance. He already has an estate. What could this mystery man possibly give to Jacob that he doesn't already have? In fact, the only thing stranger than Jacob's request of this stranger is the answer that this stranger gives to Jacob's request of the stranger. Did you follow that? Because when Jacob says, "Hey, here's what I want you to give me. I want you to bless me." Here's how this man responds. Verse 27. He says to Jacob, "Who is this?" You know, the last time that Jacob got a blessing, he got asked that exact same question by his dad. When he goes rocking into his dad's room dressed up like his brother, and his dad can't see. And so he says to Jacob in Genesis 27, verse 18, who is this? Now, to get the blessing, you know what Jacob has to do? He has to lie. He has to say, "I'm Esau." That's how he wrestles the blessing away from his family. In fact, I was thinking about this. Jacob really was a guy who wrestled all his life. He wrestled in the womb with his brother. He wrestled after he was born with his father. And yet, perhaps, the person that Jacob wrestled with the most, more than anybody else, was himself. Because think about it. When Jacob decided to lie to his father, he had to ask himself a question. Do I want to be selfish and jealous of my brother and try to steal for me what belongs to him? Or do I want to be selfless and be glad for my brother and celebrate with him? Do I want to be conniving and use my father's disability to gain a blessing for me? Or do I want to be compassionate and actually care for my father even though he can't see? Jacob was so good at winning wrestling matches with other people. But you know who he kept losing to? Himself. You know the feeling? You ever wrestled with yourself? Maybe you've wrestled with your own will. You have a goal. You want to lose some weight, get in shape, eat healthier, live better. And all that's good, but so is cheesecake, right? And you wrestle with your own will. Maybe for you wrestle with your own heart. Maybe it's because someone left you, or they broke up with you, or they betrayed you and they broke your heart. Maybe it's because you lost a loved one. And their memory overwhelms you. And no matter how often you try to feel happier, there are moments when grief just overwhelms you and you feel nothing but sadder. Maybe for you, you're just kind of having a general struggle in life. And sometimes we all get there where we just kind of feel life is kind of like a dead-end road. It's not that anything is really wrong. It's just that nothing is really right. And you just kind of feel a little empty inside. And you're hoping you can feel fuller, but no matter what you try, nothing works. You ever wrestle with yourself? You know, if Jacob's story teaches us nothing else, it's this: everybody wrestles with something. Even if you're the nicest person in the world and you never wrestle with anybody, even if you never get angry at another single solitary person, you'll wrestle with yourself. Which is why, back to Genesis 32, verse 27, when this mystery man says to Jacob, "Who is this?" Jacob has a choice to make. Because the last time that he answered that question, here's what happened. He won a wrestling match with his father and his brother, but he lost a piece of himself. And so here's the question: how is he going to win this wrestling match? Is he going to win it with a lie or with the truth? With a con or with something that is honest? This time Jacob answers differently, because this time Jacob says, "My name is Jacob. That's who I am. And I need a blessing for Jacob. Not just a blessing that belongs to my brother." To which this man says, "Okay, since you've told me your real name, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a new name, brand new name. Your name is no longer going to be Jacob, it's going to be Israel." Now, this is quite a blessing, because Israel happens to be the name not only of a man, but of a whole nation. This mystery man says to Jacob in this moment, your name is now going to be Israel, and your name is going to be so great that they're going to name a whole country after you. Would anybody like a whole country named after you? That's the blessing that this guy gets. But then the man continues and he says, here's the reason this is going to be your name. It's because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Old Testament written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew name Israel means one who struggles with God, one who wrestles. with the Lord. Now here's the thing, Jacob's been wrestling with people for a long time. But on this night, it turns out that in this wrestling match, Jacob is not just wrestling with a man, he's wrestling with someone who is more than a man, which is why he gets the name Israel. Because Israel's not just wrestling with a human, he's wrestling with God. And Israel finally gets it. When he gets this new name, a light bulb comes on. Genesis 32, verse 30, he says, I think I may have just seen God face to face. And yet my life was spared. In other words, Israel, after his wrestling match and after he wins with this man, he says, I think that was God, and he could have pulverized me. He could have destroyed me. I pinned him to the ground, but he could have pinned me and killed me. But instead, here's what he did. Instead, he just wounded me. Here's how we know that he was wounded. In verse 31, as the sun begins to rise, this man who's now named Israel is going to see his brother. And by the way, just so you know, that story works out fine. His brother does not try to kill him. The two of them hug it out. Everything's all good. But as he's going to see his brother in verse 31, he's limping because of his hip. He's wobbling because he has a wound. Here's what happened. Israel got a win, but not without first receiving a wound. I hope that every single person in this room, in some wrestling match that you've been in, has gotten a win or two. I hope that's true for you. But here's what I also know. I know that no matter how many wins you may have gotten, there's not a single person in this room who hasn't also gotten a wound. Because wounds are just part of life. But it's a funny thing about wounds, and here's why wounds can be so valuable, and here's why wounds are sometimes so needed. People will respect you if you win. Who in here likes to win? Anybody like to win? They'll respect you when you win. But they'll identify with you when you're wounded. And there is a difference. Let's say you won at the weight loss game and you got in shape and you lost the weight and you're buff and you're strong and you're healthy. People will respect you for that, and they'll look at you and they will go, how did you do what you did? But here's the thing, sometimes, even if you're the greatest weight loss and fitness champion in the world, sometimes someone, if they're struggling in their own journey, they just want to know if you still get hungry too. Because they'll respect you for winning. They'll respect you for being healthy. But they'll be able to identify with your hunger and your wounds. Or, let's say that you went through a journey of grief. You lost somebody. And here's the thing. You never really moved past it, but you can move forward from it. And let's say you went from heartbreak to a whole heart. And you feel much better and you're much happier than you used to be. If somebody is going through their own grief journey, they'll want to know from you how you managed to pull that off, because it's a big deal. But sometimes if they're in the throes of grief, what they really want is not a how-to manual to get through grief. What they really want is to know whether you ever still get sad too. Because people respect people who win. But they identify with people who have wounds. Maybe you've managed to turn over a new leaf and start a new life. You've gone from that moment where nothing was really going wrong, but nothing was really going right, and now everything is really going right. And you're churning and burning, and everything is fantastic, and you feel full. You know what? You could probably start a big old course and tell people how you did it, because a lot of people would buy it. But if someone is kind of struggling in life, they might want to know if you still ever feel a little empty too. Because people respect people who have wins. But they identify with people who have wounds. You know, one of the big lessons that we can learn from Jacob's story is very simply this. Sometimes, your wounds are just as valuable and just as helpful as your wins. Here's how far this reaches. Here's how deep this goes. So 2,000 years after this man named Israel has this encounter with this mystery man, and he wins. There's this man named Jesus, and he's talking to his disciples. He's talking to his disciples about the greatest win that any human being can ever have. You know what the greatest win is? Heaven. That's a good win. Real good win. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, this is what heaven's going to be like. Matthew 8, verse 11, I say to you that many people are going to come from the east and from the west, and they're going to take their places at this feast in heaven. There's going to be food in heaven, thank God. I do hope there's cheesecake, and I hope it doesn't come with calories in heaven. But look at the guest list of this feast in heaven, okay? Abraham's going to be there. Real famous Old Testament dude. Isaac's going to be there. You know, the husband of Rebekah, who has these two twins. And who else is going to be there? Who else is going to be there? Jacob. Now, here's what's fascinating about Jesus' guest list. Here's what makes this list so cool. It was not unusual in the ancient world for people to get name changes, especially in the Old Testament. You see it all over the place. In fact, the very first person on Jesus' guest list, Abraham. Abraham was not born as Abraham. He was born as Abram. When he was born, his name in Hebrew meant father. But it turns out that Abram was not just a father, he was a father of many, which is what the Hebrew name Abraham means. He has many descendants. And God knew about that, so he took his given name and he changed it to a God name. He says, you're not just going to be a daddy, you're going to be like a big daddy. So I'm not going to call you just Abraham or Abram, I'm going to call you Abraham. And so Jesus is going through this guest list, and he starts with Abraham. And then he goes to Isaac. But then he gets to the third name on the list, which is fascinating. Because if Jesus is talking about names, you would think he would use a name that represents a win. And there ain't any better win than struggling with God and overcoming. But when Jesus gets to the third name on his guest list, for heaven, he doesn't use a name that comes after a win. He uses a name that a guy had when he received a wound. He uses the name of Jacob. Because Jesus knows this. Sometimes, wounds are just as valuable and just as helpful as wins. You know this. The greatest win in the history of the world was a win that Jesus got when he wrestled death to death. That's a pretty good win. He dies, he rises after 3 days, he starts appearing to people, and there's this one man, actually one of his disciples, who's having his own wrestling match with his faith. His name is Thomas. And even though people are seeing and believing that Jesus has wrestled death to death, and even though people are seeing and believing that Jesus has won, Thomas is struggling to get it through his head. Until Jesus appears to him too. But here's the funny thing about Jesus' appearance to Thomas. He doesn't just appear to Thomas and say, "Look at me, I won." Here's what he does in John 20. John 20, verse 27, he goes to Thomas and he says, "I want you to put your finger here." Where's here? In my hand. Because there you're going to find a wound. A wound of a nail. And I want you to reach out your hand and I want you to place it into my side. How could Thomas do that? Well, he could do that because there he would find a wound of a spear that pierced him through. And on the basis of my wounds, Thomas says, I want you to stop doubting and believe. Because sometimes, wounds are just as important and just as valuable as wins. In fact, the wounds that Jesus had received are the wounds that actually change eternity. So, let me just leave you with a question. Are you willing to share your wounds with those who need them? I know the fear. If I share them, people will shame me. Or if I admit that I sometimes fall, I might just lose it all. Remember that your wounds might just be the wounds that somebody else needs to see. And if you don't believe me, just ask Jacob. Or even better, just look at Jesus. Because his wounds really did change eternity. Those are wounds worth sharing, don't you think?